Ethan Caldwell had it all, or at least that's what it looked like from the outside. At 40 years old, he had built a tech empire from the ground up, starting with nothing more than a few ambitious ideas and relentless determination. Now he sat at the top, watching over his city from his sleek, glass-walled corner office. The skyline stretched before him, a reflection of his own rise to power, each towering building a symbol of how far he'd come. For Ethan, success was everything without it. Who was he? He didn't have time for distractions, especially not the kind that pulled at emotions he had long learned to bury. After all, emotions made you weak, and weakness had no place in his life. He glanced at his watch. 6:15 p.m. It was time to head home, or rather, to the penthouse he occasionally called home when he wasn't traveling or too consumed with work to leave the office. With a sigh, he stood up from his desk, grabbing his designer suit jacket and slipping it on. It was just another day in the life of a man who couldn't afford to stop moving. As Ethan stepped out of the building, the crisp evening air greeted him, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled comfort of his office. Downtown was bustling, as always, with people hurrying by, their faces illuminated by the glow of streetlights and passing cars. He liked this part of the day, the moment between work and whatever came next, a pause in the constant rush of his life. He felt in control here among the busy streets and high-rise buildings that made up his world. But tonight something disrupted that sense of control. As he approached his parked car, a man stepped forward from the shadows, his clothes ragged, face weary. Ethan immediately tensed, instinctively checking his surroundings. The man held out a hand, his voice hoarse and low. "Excuse me, sir. Could you spare some change?" Ethan's eyes narrowed as he studied the man. He was older, maybe in his mid-40s, with graying hair that was matted and unkempt. His face bore the signs of a hard life, wrinkles etched deep into his skin, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame, as though they hadn't been properly washed in weeks. The man was a stark contrast to the clean, polished world Ethan inhabited. "Sorry, I don't carry cash," Ethan said dismissively, his hand already reaching for the handle of his luxury sedan. "Wait, please," the man's voice cracked with desperation. "I just need something to eat. I lost my job, my house. My name's Jacob. We used to live in the same neighborhood." Ethan froze for a second, not out of recognition but more out of annoyance. He didn't like when people lingered. Turning back to face the man, he shook his head. "Look, I'm not interested in a sob story," Ethan replied coolly. "There are shelters. Go there if you need help." Jacob's face fell, his once hopeful expression collapsing into despair. "I tried. It's not that simple." Ethan sighed, his patience running thin. "Everyone has a story. We all have struggles. It's on you to get back up. No one's going to do it for you," he said, pulling out his car keys and pressing the button to unlock his car. The lights of the luxury sedan blinked to life, casting a bright glow on both men. For a moment, there was silence between them. The busy city continued around them, but in that small space it felt as though everything had gone still. Jacob swallowed hard, a lifetime of pride and dignity clashing with the desperate need for help. "Please," he whispered, barely able to meet Ethan's gaze. "I'm not asking for much. Just something." Ethan glanced at Jacob one last time, the briefest flicker of pity crossing his mind, but he quickly buried it under layers of indifference. Without another word, he got into his car, closed the door, and drove away, leaving Jacob standing alone on the sidewalk, his hand still outstretched. As the city lights blurred past him, Ethan tried to shake off the encounter. He convinced himself it didn't matter after all. People like Jacob were a dime a dozen in a city like this. You couldn't help everyone, and frankly, why should he? He had worked hard for what he had. No one had given him a handout. But for reasons he couldn't quite explain, the image of Jacob's defeated figure lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Ethan arrived at his penthouse, the glass doors sliding shut behind him with a soft hiss. The space was immaculate, white marble floors, sleek black furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. It was the kind of place that should have made him feel powerful, untouchable. But tonight, as he stood in the middle of the cold, modern luxury, Ethan felt a strange emptiness creeping in. He shrugged off his jacket and tossed it onto a chair, loosening his tie as he walked over to the kitchen. Everything was automated, top of the line. He barely had to lift a finger to live in this space. The fridge hummed softly as it slid open at his touch, revealing a neatly organized array of gourmet meals and expensive wines. He grabbed a bottle of imported whiskey, pouring himself a glass as he leaned against the counter. As he sipped the drink, his thoughts drifted back to Jacob, the homeless man on the street, the look of desperation in his eyes, the tremble in his voice. Ethan shook his head, trying to push the image away. Why should it bother him? He didn't owe that man anything. Life wasn't fair. Ethan had learned that a long time ago. He'd fought his way to the top, clawing through setbacks, betrayals, and failures. If Jacob couldn't do the same, that was his problem. Still, the encounter gnawed at him. Ethan had never been the type to dwell on these things, but something about Jacob's words, about how they had once lived in the same neighborhood, struck a chord. He tried to remember, to piece together fragments of his past, but nothing came to him. The neighborhood he grew up in wasn't exactly rich, but it wasn't the kind of place that produced men like Jacob. Or at least, that's what Ethan had always thought. He downed the rest of his whiskey, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. The soft chime of his phone snapped him out of his thoughts. Ethan glanced at the screen, an email from one of his investors. His brows furrowed as he opened it. The message was short and to the point. We need to talk. Urgent. Ethan sighed, tossing the phone onto the counter. It was always something. No matter how high he climbed, no matter how much money he made, it never felt like enough. There was always more to do, more to prove. He set the empty glass down with a little more force than intended, the sound echoing through the silent penthouse. He walked over to the windows, gazing out at the city below. The streets were alive with activity, people hurrying to catch buses, cars honking in traffic, neon signs flickering in the distance. It was a world he both loved and resented. The constant noise, the relentless pace, it was what had fueled his rise to the top, but it was also what kept him from ever feeling truly at peace. Ethan's phone buzzed again, pulling him from his reverie. This time it was a text from his assistant. Reminder, you have a dinner meeting with Mr. Green at 8 p.m. He glanced at the clock, 7:15. Plenty of time. Ethan wasn't looking forward to the dinner. It was just another tedious obligation, another way to maintain his connections and keep the business thriving. Mr. Green was an important investor, one of the big players in the tech industry, and keeping him happy was a necessity, not a choice. But as Ethan dressed for the evening, slipping into yet another expensive suit, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had built a life of wealth and power, but tonight, for reasons he couldn't fully understand, it all felt hollow. The drive to the restaurant was uneventful, the streets a blur of lights and shadows as Ethan's car cut through the city. The restaurant, an upscale spot that catered to the elite, was as pretentious as always. Ethan walked in, greeted by the hostess with a polished smile, and was led to a private room where Mr. Green was already waiting. "Ethan, good to see you," Mr. Green said, standing to shake his hand. He was an older man, well into his 60s, with a sharp, calculating gaze and the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You too, Mr. Green," Ethan replied, forcing a smile as they sat down. The conversation quickly turned to business. Mr. Green talked about stock prices, market trends, and future investments. It was the same conversation Ethan had had 1,000 times before. He nodded in all the right places, making mental notes of what needed to be done to keep the investors happy. But his mind kept wandering back to Jacob. "So what's next for your company?" Mr. Green asked, leaning forward slightly. Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Usually he had a well-rehearsed answer, something that would impress and reassure, but tonight his thoughts felt scattered. "We're expanding," he said finally, the words feeling hollow even as they left his mouth. "New projects in development, looking to diversify our portfolio." Mr. Green nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good. Keep pushing. That's what I like about you, Ethan, you're relentless." Relentless. The word echoed in Ethan's mind as the dinner continued, each course more lavish than the last. Was that really what defined him? Relentlessness? The drive to keep moving forward no matter the cost? By the time the dinner ended and Ethan returned to his penthouse, he felt drained. He poured himself another glass of whiskey, but this time it didn't go down as easily. The taste was bitter, clinging to the back of his throat. Ethan stood in front of the window again, the city laid out before him like a glittering map of all his achievements. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of Jacob's face, the man he had left behind in the street, begging for help. It was unsettling, the way the encounter had wormed its way into his mind, refusing to let go. As he stood there, alone in the silence of his penthouse, Ethan realized something that disturbed him more than anything else. For all his success, for all his wealth and power, he wasn't sure if he even knew what it meant to be happy anymore. It had only been a few days since Ethan's encounter with Jacob, but the man's face still haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the desperate expression, the one he'd brushed aside with cold indifference. Ethan tried to shake it off, telling himself it didn't matter. He had his own life to focus on, and right now things were about to get complicated. The trouble started with a phone call. Ethan was in the middle of a meeting, reviewing quarterly projections with his board members, when his assistant interrupted. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice unusually tense, "there's a call for you. It's urgent." Ethan shot her an annoyed look. He didn't like being interrupted, but something in her tone made him pause. "I'll take it in my office," he said, excusing himself from the room. The moment he picked up the phone, he knew something was wrong. On the other end of the line was his lead investor, Mr. Thompson, and his voice was anything but reassuring. "Ethan, we've got a problem," Thompson began, his voice low and serious. "What kind of problem?" Ethan asked, already feeling a knot form in his stomach. "There's been some discrepancies in the financial reports, numbers that don't add up, and it looks like someone's been moving money around, big money." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" "That's impossible. We've had internal audits. Everything's been accounted for." "That's what we thought too," Thompson replied. "But the auditors missed something. A lot of things, actually. There's evidence of embezzlement, and it's pointing directly to your CFO." Ethan's mind raced. His CFO, John, had been with the company from the beginning. They'd built this empire together. The idea that John could be involved in something like this was unthinkable. "I'll handle it," Ethan said, his voice tight. "I'll get to the bottom of this." "You better," Thompson warned. "Because if this doesn't get resolved quickly, investors are going to start pulling out. And if that happens, you're going to be in deep trouble, Ethan. This isn't just a small blip on the radar, we're talking about millions of dollars. Your company could be at risk." Ethan hung up the phone, his hands trembling slightly. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after all the years he'd spent building his company, his reputation. He couldn't let it fall apart. But as the hours ticked by, the severity of the situation became clear. Meetings with the legal team, frantic calls with auditors, and long conversations with board members painted a grim picture. The more they uncovered, the worse it got. The missing money wasn't just a fluke, it was a carefully orchestrated scheme, and it had been going on for months without anyone noticing. John, his trusted CFO, had been siphoning off company funds into shell accounts. When confronted, John didn't deny it. In fact, he confessed without much of a fight, claiming that he had personal debts he couldn't escape and saw no other way out. Ethan couldn't believe it. The betrayal hit him like a sledgehammer to the gut. How had he not seen this coming? How had he let it get this bad? The fallout was swift and brutal. News of the embezzlement scandal leaked to the press, and within days the headlines were splashed across every financial news outlet. Caldwell Tech in turmoil as embezzlement scandal rocks the company. Investors started pulling out, stock prices plummeted, and Ethan found himself at the center of a public relations nightmare. His phone was ringing off the hook, calls from angry shareholders, worried employees, and old business contacts who were suddenly very distant. Each day brought new problems, lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and the constant scrutiny of the media. Ethan had always prided himself on being able to control the narrative, but this time the story had spiraled out of his grasp. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt powerless. The final blow came when Thompson, his lead investor, made the call to officially pull his funding. "I'm sorry, Ethan, but I can't keep my money tied up in a sinking ship. It's not personal, it's just business." Ethan's empire was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In the days that followed, Ethan's life became a blur of damage control. His days were filled with endless meetings, trying to salvage what little he could of the company. But it was no use. The scandal was too big, the damage too deep. His once loyal team members were either jumping ship or distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with the fallout. The board called an emergency meeting a vote of no confidence. Ethan had never imagined this day would come, but there it was. One by one, the board members, men and women he had worked alongside for years, cast their votes. By the end of it, it was clear Ethan was out. He had lost control of the company he had built from the ground up. Walking out of the boardroom for the last time, Ethan felt a strange numbness settle over him. The security team handed him a box containing his personal belongings from the office, a humiliating ritual he had never thought he'd be subjected to. As he stood in the lobby of his own company, holding that small box of memories, he felt more like a ghost than the powerful CEO he had once been. Outside, the cold wind whipped through the streets, cutting through his expensive suit. The city, once a symbol of his success, now felt distant and uncaring. Ethan walked aimlessly, not knowing where to go or what to do next. His penthouse was still there, but it felt more like a cage than a home. For the first time in his life, Ethan understood what it meant to be truly alone. The night grew darker, the streets quieter, and Ethan found himself standing in front of a park. He sat down on a bench, staring at the world around him. The distant sounds of traffic hummed in the background, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Jacob again, the homeless man he had brushed aside without a second thought. The irony wasn't lost on him. In a way, he was now the one begging for scraps, just like Jacob had been. Not for money, but for a second chance, for some way to reclaim his life. But deep down, Ethan knew that things would never be the same again. While Ethan's world unraveled, Jacob Rivers had slowly begun piecing his life back together. After that fateful encounter with Ethan on the street, Jacob had hit rock bottom again. The rejection from someone he once vaguely knew had shaken him, leaving him feeling more invisible than ever. But it also sparked something else in him, a resolve to fight back against the overwhelming despair that had taken over his life. Jacob spent weeks bouncing between shelters, doing odd jobs and scraping together enough to get by. What changed his course was a chance encounter at a local church that ran outreach programs for the homeless. He met a man named Carl, a former construction worker who now volunteered his time helping people like Jacob regain their footing. "You've got skills," Carl had said one evening, after watching Jacob help repair some old, broken-down furniture at the shelter. "Why don't you come by the wood shop I run? We're always looking for an extra pair of hands, and I can teach you how to work the more advanced tools." Jacob was hesitant at first. He hadn't worked with his hands in years, not since he had lost his carpentry job when the economy tanked, and then his family had fallen apart. The weight of failure had crushed his confidence. But Carl had a way of making people believe in themselves again, and eventually Jacob agreed. The wood shop became Jacob's second chance. At first, the work was tough. His hands were clumsy, out of practice, and his mind often wandered to the past, to the family he'd lost, to the man he used to be. But with each day, as the sawdust collected under his boots and the rhythmic sound of hammering filled the air, Jacob began to feel a little more like himself. The wood shop wasn't just a job, it was a community. The men and women who worked there were all trying to rebuild something, whether it was their careers, their families, or their sense of self-worth. And in that space, Jacob found solace. He began taking on more responsibility, working with Carl to teach newer members of the team how to craft tables, chairs, and other simple pieces. He started to dream again, quietly, about what might come next. Maybe one day he could save enough to rent his own place, get back to a life that felt stable. It was slow, but for the first time in years, Jacob felt like he was moving forward. One afternoon, after a particularly productive day in the shop, Carl pulled Jacob aside. "You've got a gift," Jacob Carl said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "I think it's time you took on more responsibility around here. How'd you like to manage the shop when I'm not around?" Jacob blinked in surprise. "Me? Manage the shop? I don't know, Carl. I'm not exactly." Exactly what Carl interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Capable? Trustworthy? You've more than proven yourself, Jacob. Don't let what happened before define you. This is your shot to take control again." Jacob was speechless for a moment. No one had trusted him with real responsibility in so long. The thought of stepping up like that both excited and terrified him. But after a moment he nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." And so, just like that, Jacob's life began to shift. He took on more hours at the shop, learning the ins and outs of running a business. Slowly, his confidence returned. He even started talking to his estranged daughter, Emily, again. The conversations were brief, tentative, but they were a start. Jacob could feel hope seeping back into the cracks of his broken life. It was late one evening, after a long day at the wood shop, when Jacob's past came crashing back into his life. The bell above the door chimed, signaling a customer. Jacob, who was busy cleaning up the workspace, didn't immediately look up. He called out, "Be right with you," and continued wiping down the sawdust-covered counter. "I'm looking for the manager," a voice said from the entrance, hesitant but familiar. Jacob froze. He turned slowly, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the man standing in the doorway. Ethan Caldwell. The same man who had brushed him off on the street just weeks ago now stood before him, looking nothing like the confident CEO he had once been. Ethan's usually sharp suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and his face haggard with exhaustion. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders sagged as if the weight of the world had finally settled on him. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. The tension was thick, a palpable reminder of how their paths had crossed before, in circumstances so different from now. Jacob, Ethan finally said, his voice hoarse. I didn't know you worked here." Jacob slowly set down the rag he'd been holding, wiping his hands on his apron. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face steady. "Yeah, I manage the place now," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to find the right words. I lost everything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "The company, my reputation, it's all gone, and I." Jacob raised a hand, stopping him. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" Ethan swallowed hard, his pride clearly bruised by what he was about to say next. "I need a job," he confessed, his eyes filled with the same desperation Jacob had seen in his own reflection not so long ago. "I'll take anything. I just need to start over." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Jacob. Here was Ethan, the man who had once dismissed him without a second thought, now standing in front of him, begging for the very thing Jacob had been denied on that fateful day a chance. Jacob could have laughed. He could have thrown Ethan's rejection back in his face, told him to get lost, just like Ethan had done to him. But Jacob wasn't that man anymore. He had learned too much in the past few weeks about humility, about second chances, and about the power of grace. Jacob studied Ethan for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We're always looking for an extra pair of hands," he said quietly. "You can start tomorrow." Ethan blinked, clearly taken aback by Jacob's response. "Really? You'd give me a chance?" Jacob's expression softened, though his voice remained firm. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Ethan. Even you." Ethan showed up the next morning at the wood shop, looking more like a shadow of the man he had once been. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility that Jacob recognized all too well. When Ethan walked through the door, he was no longer the powerful CEO who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar deals. Now, he was just a man trying to find his place in a world that had left him behind. Jacob greeted him with a nod, handing him a pair of work gloves. "We've got a lot to do today," he said simply, not offering any special treatment. "I need someone to sand down the wood for the new tables we're working on. Think you can handle that?" Ethan glanced at the pile of unfinished wood stacked against the far wall. It wasn't glamorous work, not by a long shot, but he nodded. "I'll figure it out," he said, slipping on the gloves. Jacob watched him for a moment, then turned back to his own task. He wasn't sure what to expect from Ethan. Would he complain? Would he struggle and give up? But as the hours passed, Jacob was surprised to see that Ethan kept his head down and worked hard, silently sanding the wood with careful precision. At one point, Carl came over to Jacob, nodding toward Ethan with a curious expression. "Isn't that the guy who owns that big tech company? What's he doing here?" Jacob gave a small shrug. "Not anymore. He's just another worker now." Carl raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, as long as he pulls his weight." And to everyone's surprise, Ethan did. He worked through the day, sweat staining his shirt as he moved from one task to another without complaint. At first, his hands were clumsy, unused to the physical labor, but as the day went on, he found a rhythm. There was something almost meditative about the work, something grounding in the simple act of shaping wood, in the tangible results of each stroke of the sander. By the time the sun began to set, Ethan's muscles ached, his back sore from bending over the workbench all day. But there was also a strange sense of satisfaction that he hadn't felt in years. For so long, his life had been about abstract numbers, profits, stock prices, contracts. But today, he had created something real, something he could touch and see. As the other workers began to pack up for the day, Jacob walked over to where Ethan was still working. "You did good today," Jacob said, handing him a bottle of water. Ethan took it with a grateful nod, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Thanks," he said, his voice low. "It's been a long time since I've worked with my hands." Jacob chuckled softly. "It shows. But you'll get better." For a moment they stood in silence, the day's work behind them and the cool evening air settling in. Ethan hesitated before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Jacob, for that day on the street, for how I treated you." Jacob didn't say anything at first, just studied Ethan's face, the genuine regret in his eyes. It wasn't easy for a man like Ethan to apologize, but Jacob could see that this was different, this was real. "You were a different person then," Jacob finally said, his voice steady. "We both were." Ethan looked down at his hands, the calluses starting to form on his palms after just one day of work. "I didn't understand," he admitted. I thought people like you were just..." Just what Jacob interrupted, his tone firm but not angry. "Lazy? Worthless? Like you couldn't imagine ever being in that position yourself." Ethan winced, the truth of Jacob's words stinging him. "Yeah," he confessed, "but now I know better." Jacob sighed, leaning against the workbench. "I used to think that way too about other people. Before everything fell apart, I thought I was untouchable, that I had it all figured out, but life has a way of humbling you." Ethan nodded, the weight of his own mistakes hanging heavy in the air between them. "It's humbling. All right," he said quietly. Jacob took a deep breath, then turned to look at Ethan. "Look, I didn't give you this job because I wanted to punish you or make you feel guilty. I gave you this job because I believe people can change. I've had second chances in my life more than I deserve. And now you've got one too." Ethan stared at Jacob, overwhelmed by the man's generosity, by the grace he didn't deserve. "I don't know if I'm worth it," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I've messed up so much." Jacob shook his head. "It's not about being worth it, Ethan. It's about what you do next. You can't change the past, but you can decide who you want to be from here on out." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding slowly as Jacob's words sank in. He had been so consumed by his failure, by the shame of losing everything, that he hadn't considered the possibility of starting over. But maybe Jacob was right. Maybe this wasn't the end, maybe it was a new beginning. Weeks passed, and Ethan slowly began to settle into his new life at the woodshop. It wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges, both physical and emotional. His body ached in ways it never had before, and he was constantly reminded of how far he had fallen. But alongside the exhaustion was a quiet sense of purpose that Ethan hadn't felt in years. Jacob had become more than just a boss. He was a mentor, guiding Ethan not just in the work, but in the process of rebuilding his life. They spent long hours sanding, carving, and crafting furniture, and with each passing day the tension between them eased. Ethan came to admire Jacob's quiet strength, his resilience, and his unwavering commitment to giving people a second chance. One evening after the shop had closed and most of the workers had gone home, Jacob and Ethan sat outside on a bench, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The cool evening air was filled with the scent of freshly cut wood, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a sense of peace. "You've come a long way," Jacob said, breaking the comfortable silence. Ethan glanced over at him, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thanks. I didn't think I could do this. Any of it, really. Not after everything that happened." Jacob nodded, his gaze fixed on the fading sunlight. "It's not easy, but you're getting there. You just have to keep going." Ethan looked down at his hands, now rough and calloused from weeks of hard work. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who believed that power and wealth were the only things that mattered. The man who had turned his back on people like Jacob, convinced that he was above them. That man was gone, replaced by someone who was still trying to figure out who he was. "I've been thinking about what you said," Ethan began, his voice thoughtful, "about second chances, and I realized that I've never really understood what that meant. Not until now." Jacob turned to him, listening intently. "I used to think that success was everything," Ethan continued. "That if I lost my company, if I lost my status, I'd have nothing. But now, I'm starting to see that maybe losing all of that wasn't the worst thing that could have happened to me." Jacob smiled faintly, recognizing the truth in Ethan's words. It's funny how life works out sometimes. What feels like the end is really just a new beginning. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of his own transformation. He had spent so long trying to control everything, to be on top of the world, that he hadn't stopped to consider what truly mattered. Now, in the quiet simplicity of the woodshop, surrounded by people who had also been broken by life, he was beginning to understand that success wasn't about money or power. It was about resilience. It was about finding strength in the face of failure and learning how to rebuild piece by piece. As they sat together in the fading light, Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I've been meaning to give this to you," he said, handing it to Ethan. Ethan frowned, confused, and opened the envelope. Inside was a check, a modest sum of money, his first real paycheck since losing everything. "You've earned it," Jacob said simply. "You've been working hard, and you deserve to be paid for that work." Ethan stared at the check, emotions swirling inside him. It wasn't much, not compared to the millions he used to deal with, but it meant more than any paycheck he'd ever received. It was a symbol of his new life, of the work he had put in to rebuild himself from the ground up. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Jacob gave him a knowing smile. "You've earned this, Ethan. Don't forget that." The following days at the woodshop were different. Ethan no longer felt like an outsider. The other workers had started to warm up to him, seeing him not as the rich man who had fallen from grace, but as one of them, someone who had been broken by life and was working hard to put the pieces back together. One afternoon, as Ethan was sanding down a large oak table, he overheard two of the workers talking nearby. One of them, a younger man named Travis, was going through a tough time. He had just lost his apartment and didn't know where he was going to stay. Without thinking, Ethan walked over to him. "Hey, I've got a spare room at my place," he offered. "It's not much, but you're welcome to crash there until you get back on your feet." Travis looked at him, surprised. "Really? You'd do that for me?" Ethan smiled. "Yeah, I know what it's like to be in your shoes." The gesture wasn't much, but for Ethan it was a sign of how far he had come. He had spent so much of his life looking down on people, convinced that he was better than them. Now he saw the truth: everyone was just trying to survive, and sometimes all it took was a little kindness to help someone get through the day. Months passed and the seasons changed. Ethan's life, once marked by opulence and excess, had settled into a rhythm of simplicity and hard work. He found joy in the little things now, in the smell of sawdust, in the feel of a perfectly sanded piece of wood, in the camaraderie of the people he worked with every day. He didn't miss his old life. In fact, he barely thought about it at all. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Jacob and Ethan stood side by side, locking up the woodshop for the night. "You know," Jacob said, glancing at Ethan with a smile, "you've changed a lot since you first came here." Ethan chuckled. "I had to. Life didn't exactly give me a choice." Jacob nodded. "No, but you made the choice to change. That's what matters." Ethan looked out at the horizon, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had lost everything, but in doing so he had gained something far more valuable. He had gained perspective, humility, and an understanding of what truly mattered in life. "I think I finally get it," Ethan said quietly. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "Get what?" "What it means to have a second chance. It's not about going back to the way things were. It's about moving forward. It's about becoming someone better." Jacob smiled, clapping a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've come a long way, my friend." As they walked away from the woodshop, side by side, Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of his past mistakes had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose that couldn't be measured in dollars or status. For the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell knew what it meant to be truly successful.